Life Unrehearsed, brought to you by Lianas Senior Transition Support, helping you navigate home care and senior residences.
And welcome back to Life Unrehearsed. Matt Delvecchio here, specializing in home care, elder care planning, and the senior living industry. Thanks for tuning in on our first show of 2024. Well, do you find yourself spending a little too much time online? You know, you ever get those weekly notifications on your phone saying you averaged X amount of hours per day online? I get that. And sometimes I say, there is no way I spent that much time online until you actually think about it. And it's ridiculous. We're talking hours and hours. And it is a problem. It really is. And, you know, Dr. Aron Rosenberg worked on his PhD studying how student use of the internet shapes their learning and behaviors. He figured that cutting the internet from his own life would help him better grasp its influence on our brains. Aron disconnected himself from the online world just as the rest of us were becoming increasingly immersed in it in 2020 in the heart of the pandemic. In fact, he did it for a year. His journey's chronicled in a fascinating book called Jacking Out, a Journal of Years Spent Offline. Well, let's hear about this unique experience. I have Dr. Aron Rosenberg on the line. He's now a faculty lecturer at McGill University in the Education Department. Aron, welcome to Life Unrehearsed.
Hi, Matt. Thanks so much for having me on.
Well, thank you for joining us. Boy, what an experiment. So can you tell us a little bit more about, well, first of all, what inspired you to spend a year offline?
I mean, it was a weird decision to make, especially, I didn't know that COVID was coming and that the lockdown was going to change everything. But in 2019, when I was preparing for the project, I tried to figure out why I wanted to do it. And it was one of those things where I felt like it was something I'd been working towards for a long time, but I didn't know the exact reason. Part of it is, as you were suggesting in your introduction, that we're all just so maybe addicted or just compelled to use our devices and the internet so much that I wanted to see whether I could do it, almost like a challenge for myself. But I also was interested in bringing attention to some of the underexplored impacts of our digital use. So a lot of people talk about the mental health impacts and how it affects us from our day-to-day lives. But sometimes it's harder to look at the hidden impacts, like how it impacts the environment with all the energy used, or how it impacts the workers who have to do a lot of the work involved in manufacturing our devices and making sure that they work for us and then disposing of them at their end of life. One little story is when I was preparing to go offline, I was asking a lot of my friends and colleagues what they thought about cloud storage and how they understood the way that we use all these internet, like the clouds that we would store our files on or whatnot. And I realized that most people don't actually know what cloud storage is. People actually think that it has something to do with maybe satellites shooting files around in the sky, but a lot of people were unaware of the fact that it's just a computer stored off-site, like a big warehouse of computers. So I think the biggest reason why I wanted to spend a year offline was to bring attention to those types of hidden impacts of the internet.
Right. And, a noble cause, I can't imagine. A year offline. So can you give us some examples of what you couldn't do and then what you did do to communicate?
Absolutely. Yeah. So my rules for myself was I couldn't go online myself. I couldn't ask people to do things online for me, and I couldn't look at online screens. So it caused a lot of difficulties. I was trying to complete a PhD at the time, and so the logistics of just doing school was very difficult. And then also just other logistical things in my life, like paying bills, buying train tickets, that all was a lot more difficult. But really the hardest thing turned out, or the thing that I found the most difficult was actually the connection with my family and friends. During 2020, my brother had a kid, and I was very excited to be able to connect with them, but they live in Toronto and I'm here in Montreal. So I didn't think about it, but I wasn't able to do a lot of the video calling or sending photos that I would have hoped to do. So really one of the biggest challenges was just staying connected to the people I cared about.
Interesting. And this is in the middle of the pandemic, of course, right, Aron? And, we heard so much about social isolation and how it's affected so many people. And here you are purposely going offline. So that really must have affected you, family and friends, not able to go online and connect with them. Did it get to a point, because throwing the pandemic here, did it get to a point, Aron, where you said, you know what, this just isn't worth it. I'm not going to do this for a year?
It's a funny question. I like that question because I had a bunch of people suggest that exact thing to me in 2020. And I had two of my uncles who are both very different guys, but both phoned me during the year offline and said, Aron, I know you're doing this for all sorts of important reasons, but considering everything, maybe more important for you to postpone the project, try it again in a couple of years. And I asked both of these uncles in separate conversations, like, what is it that you think why do you think I should postpone it? And they both said, well, we're just worried that you're going to be too isolated. And I think it's just important that you connect with your family and friends. And on the phone call with my uncles, I said, but don't you see the irony in that? Like right now we're talking on the phone and connecting about the project, but the ability to connect isn't limited by being offline to the extent that I think a lot of us imagine it is. Like, yes, it's very true that the internet was such an important lifeline for people to stay connected during COVID, but especially I had partners that I was living with, and especially in like small ways, using the phone, using letter writing, there are still lots of ways to connect with people and stay feeling that sense of community even without using the internet.
Listening to Life Unrehearsed, Matt Delvecchio here, and I'm talking with Dr. Aron Lee Rosenberg, who spent a year offline in 2020 during his PhD research at McGill and wrote a book about the experience. I do want to tackle a couple things here with you, Aron. This was all related also to your PhD research topic.
Right.
And so did indeed, you're looking back now, I would imagine it was an influential role in your research and what you were able to present.
Yeah, it definitely reshaped my PhD in a big way. I think going into the experience, I was really excited to be really critical and to point out a lot of the issues and a lot of the challenges with digital technologies and with the internet. But because I was doing it during COVID, the opposite sort of happened. And I started to recognize just how important it is that people have the ability to connect. I think because we live in a pretty affluent part of the world, we forget that about half of the world's population doesn't have regular internet access. Mm-hmm. And during COVID, I started to recognize just how valuable it is to have that access, even though I was simultaneously looking at the ways that alternatives were also valuable. So one of the big things that happened during 2020, as you may remember, is that certain communities in Canada, some rural communities, some Indigenous communities, pointed out that they actually didn't have the same access to the internet as we do in big cities like in Montreal. So my PhD shifted a little bit by trying to look at both the ways that we need to challenge the ways that we use the internet, but also the ways we need to embrace it more. And we need to ensure that for equity purposes, that everyone has the same access that you and I enjoy.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very good point there. And after you've been through all this, first of all, very quickly, you must have been counting the days as the 1 year is coming up. So what was that feeling like after a full year, where you must have really been looking forward to it? Or were you sort of accustomed to your new world?
Yeah, I was counting the days, but not in a excited way, more in an anxious way. Because as it got closer to 2021 and I realized I would be back online, all of the possibilities of all the different articles I would have to read, all the projects I would have to get back involved with, it became quite overwhelming. I mean, even just checking emails. I spent a year without checking email. And as you can imagine, January 1st, when I reopened my email, it was more horrifying than it was exciting. And I actually pretty quickly just closed the browser and went out for a walk.
I don't blame you one bit. And just as we wrap up here, let's face it, society, I think, and especially I'm talking as a parent with kids, and we are online, and I'm blaming the kids. I'll blame myself. Look in the mirror, Matt. But it is. What advice can you give to people who are considering reducing their time online?
Absolutely, yeah. I think my biggest advice is don't go drastic like I did. Try something more moderate. Maybe try 1 day a week, maybe in the evening. Think about what is something about the internet that you really would rather live without, and try to figure out how you might be able to find alternatives in your life. Because as you point out, we're not escaping it. The internet's here to stay and it's important. But I think we need to try to think more about how we can use it in ways that serve us and that don't have as many harmful impacts for the environment and for other people. Love it. Great words of advice, Aron. You wrote a book documenting this. It's called Jacking Out, a journal of a year spent offline. How can our listeners get a hold of it? Yeah, ironically, you can, of course, get it online, but if you prefer to honor the experiment and get it in person here in Montreal, it's available at Paragraph Books downtown and at St. Henry Books down in St. Henry. Support local. I love that, Aron. Well, thank you very much for telling us about your offline adventure. Thank you so much for having me on. All right, that's Dr. Aron Lee Rosenberg. His book is called Jacking Out, a journal of a year spent offline.